Scriptorium's The State of Structure webinar. In the next hour, I'm going to review results from our State of Structure survey, which we conducted in February and March of 2009. My name is Sarah O'Keefe, and I will be your host for this webinar. So, a couple of housekeeping things to get out of the way to start with. We are recording this webinar, and we will make it available to those of you that are on the call today after the session. The audio is available via telephone and also voice over IP. You can log in by following the instructions in the GoToMeeting control panel. This session is planned for approximately an hour plus another 15 minutes or so of Q&A, depending on how long it takes. In the recording that we're creating, your information will not appear, so don't worry about that. And also the Q&A itself will not be recorded. We will be cutting off the recording before that. We will make the appropriate information available to you after the event. And if you do have any trouble as part of the event, please email support@scriptorium.com. You can also send a chat message to the organizers in the chat interface, but typically email is actually better. So, if you have questions along the way, you can put those in the chat interface. If I see them there, I will try to get to them. If not, we will have some time after the session to go through them with you and talk about any questions or issues that you may have that are brought up by the content of this presentation. So, without further ado, we define structured authoring here as a publishing workflow that lets you define and automatically enforce organization of information. The most important phrase here is enforcement or automatic enforcement. There are other definitions of structured authoring that do not include enforcement. They are just, hey, we have a template and we kind of follow the template. I would define that as template-based authoring and require that a structured authoring workflow does have to include enforcement of consistent organization of information. As a result, most of the structured authoring implementations that we see are based on XML, the extensible markup language. So in the survey that we conducted in February and March, we did, in the very beginning of the survey, define structured authoring in exactly this way and asked respondents to base their information that they provided on the definition that we gave them. As you'll see later in the session, they did not necessarily always follow those instructions, but for the most part, we believe that they did. So, January and February of 2009, we spent March and April writing it up and putting together the report that went along with it. We got about 600 responses to the survey, which in PDF form is about 18 pages. It was a web-based survey done through SurveyMonkey, and we got over 600 responses. Most of those came from an email that we sent via the contentwrangler.com. I do not know what sort of bias that may have introduced into our sample. I do not know whether the people on the Content Wrangler are more or less likely to be using structure. But you should be aware that that is where we got most of our participants. The survey showed very clear momentum for structured authoring, and in fact the numbers were perhaps a bit higher than we expected. So one of the very first things that we asked people was, are you using structured authoring? Have you implemented it? Are you working on implementing? When are you going to implement if you haven't implemented? And the result was that about 30% said we have implemented. We have structure. We are using it in our organization. Another 50 to 55% said either we're working on it or we're thinking about it or we're undecided. I think the actually most shocking number that I saw here was the 16.2% that said we are not going to do this. We do not plan to implement. That means that somewhere around 84% thought that they would probably go there. Now, granted, that does include the 21% that said they were undecided, but the fact that only 16% said no, out of the question, was a bit of a surprise. We also looked at the question of, so once we got past the 29.2% that says we have implemented, we then had a further 13.5 plus 9%, so further 24% or thereabouts, that said they were either working on it or will begin this year, meaning 2009. That means that by the end of 2010 or so, if we assume it takes a year to implement, over 50% will be using structure. And that was a bit of a surprise. So we were not too surprised by the plan to start in 2010, 2011 numbers being quite low. I think that reflects more that people weren't quite sure what would happen as opposed to actual having specific plans. So the eventually number some of those might fall into 2010 or 2011. So when we looked more closely at this, we then grouped our participants into past, present, and future implementers. So past implementers were that 29.2% that said we have implemented. Present implementers were those who said we are working on it. And future implementers were those who said we're thinking about it. That did include the undecided group. So this past, present, and future altogether includes everybody except the 16% that said we're not going to do it under any circumstances. So once we did that, we then went together and grouped their responses and looked at the various factors that drive structured authoring implementation. We gave them 7 choices and then also some options to specify other things, but these were the 7 that were most important, both in our experience and then also from some of the data we had already. Now, when you look at this chart, they were asked to rank things in order of importance on a scale from 1 to 7. The numbers that you see here are the average response. So the shorter the bar, the more important a particular factor was. Things to notice here. The past, present, and future implementers were really relatively consistent across the various factors. There's not really any factor that changes past to present to future other than perhaps localization, which appears to be decreasing in importance from past to present to future. We think that might be because the people for whom localization is more important were able to justify structured authoring implementation earlier on and thus are overrepresented in the past and underrepresented in the future, but we do not know. The second thing we noted here was that, was that priorities broke down pretty clearly into 3 groups. There were the top priorities, which were reuse of content, consistency of content, and the cost and effort of developing content. Those 3 were the top 3 priorities, with reuse actually winning overall. Then you have a second group of sort of medium priority things: localization, information exchange across departments or work groups or organizations, and personalization. And then finally, compliance came in last. There were some organizations that had requirements, but generally compliance was a very low priority for most of the people that were in our survey. So we speculate here that people are moving to structure for some very objective and very straightforward kinds of reasons. They thought they could reduce the cost of producing their content. They think they can increase their reuse, which reduces the cost of content. And they believe they can increase consistency, which might be a cost argument and might also be a quality argument. We were quite surprised at how low localization ranked. Our experience with our customers in implementing is that localization is typically a top priority, or localization cost is a top priority, and that people are implementing XML for the sole purpose of improving their localization workflows. The numbers that we're seeing here do not bear that out. Localization is coming in somewhere around 4th in terms of priorities. Information exchange ranked relatively low. We did ask about reuse, which is arguably a form of information exchange, but it appears that reuse within a work group is far more important than information exchange across work groups or across organizations. That was interesting, but perhaps not shocking. And then we had personalization. Now, I happen to believe myself that personalization will increase in importance, but it looks as though at this point personalization is a fairly low-ranking kind of thing. It is not a driver of XML implementation. It might be a consideration down the road that if we go to XML, we enable personalization in the future, but it does not appear that people are moving to XML